I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists. Naming something doesn't mean that we get it. So I'll live each day with wonder. See the universe through a brand new set of eyes.
All righty. Our speakers today are two paleontologists who have individual specialties. ASHLEY Poust is ASHLEY Poust is a paleobiologist with the UC Berkeley Department of Integrative Biology. Integrative or integrative? Integrative. Okay, integrative biology. Ash also works extensively with the UC Museum of Paleontology. Almost accidental enrollment in a college geology course gave Ash a totally new way of looking at the world. That's his quote. Soon thereafter, he wrote, quote, "Every landscape, every rock has not only a current form, but an existence that stretches back into immeasurable depths of time," unquote. This long view of rocks soon led him to a study of the long view of organisms, of life here on Earth. And we'll hear about that tonight. NICHOLAS SPANO is also firmly attached to the Integrative Biology Department at Cal and Cal's Museum of Paleontology. He's actually a paleoecologist, meaning that he is broadly interested in using the fossil record to understand current and forecasted conservation issues. This is conservation paleontology, paleobiology too. Both Ash and Nick are PhD bound, and I'm certain they both agree that this statement by Ash applies. Quote, "My interest in vertebrate paleontology," he capitalized both those words. That means he's serious about those subjects. Vertebrate paleontology stems from a desire to understand as much about the world as possible by understanding its past. I imagine they want to understand the world and to protect it as well. That'll be the subject of tonight's talk. Please welcome ASHLEY Poust and Nick Spano.
I'm Ash, and I'm going to start us off by going too far back in time, and then Nick will take over about halfway to bring us forward to the present and the future. So my initial question is, how did mammals get big? So our talk is big ideas from big mammals, big animals, so I sort of have to justify that by actually talking about body size. There's a huge diversity of mammals in the world today, and we may see, little birds and bugs around as much or more often than we see mammals. But a lot of the animals that we live with the most intimately, both our food and our friends, are mammalian, fuzzy things. You see up here a couple of those examples of those animals. But I think their presence in our daily lives makes it easy to forget that these creatures have incredibly long pasts. There's a tale of history that goes out way, way back in time. And so if we are over here on the right side of this diagram, you'll see a couple diagrams like this where time moves from the left to the right, or occasionally from the bottom to the top. If we're way over here, mammals' origins are way back here in the Triassic. So for context, this line right in the middle, below the word Phanerozoic, this line in the middle is 251 million years in the past. So for comparison's sake, mammals originate at about the exact same time that we first get dinosaurs. Now, dinosaurs go extinct at this line between the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic. That's often referred to as the age of the mammal. If we zoom in on the Cenozoic, there's a bunch of weird time terms. Don't worry about those too much, or if you have questions, you can bring them back up at the end and we can clarify. But this actually has a time scale on here. So the dinosaurs go extinct at about 66 million years ago. That's pretty long, right? So when I say that's recent compared to the age of mammals, like the time period of the age of mammals starts late in the history of mammals, it's still a really, really long time. So what we're looking at here is the dinosaurs are gone at this line, mammals make it through, and then what happens? And I think that question is predicated on this understanding that the mammals that we see around us are not the type of mammal that was around for all of that long history for another 200 million years before the dinosaurs died out. This is an example of one of those early mammals. This is reconstructed based on the fossils that they found. This is what the skeleton would look like if you had the whole thing. This is what the critter would have looked like as it was creeping around. But the key thing I want to point out to you here is the scale bar. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with working in metric, but 10 millimeters is like real small, right? That's tiny. So this whole animal would have been like this big. And that's a typical example of the style of mammal that you would have found during the entirety of this period, going from 250 million years ago to 65 million years ago. All throughout here, we have mammals or mammal-like close relatives, and they're always like that. Now, that's a little bit disingenuous. So mammals actually had huge diversity. We've only in the past 10 years started to uncover all the crazy things that they're able to do. So they could swim. So this is the Jurassic. We're talking, Jurassic Park here. This is peak dinosaur times. Giant, long-necked dinosaurs tromping around during the day, eating the heck out of trees. But in the streams, there were things that had beaver tails. And there were crazy fruit-eating specialists. And there's even a crazy gliding animal that we've learned about. So the idea like flying squirrels, which don't really fly, but they glide like crazy, glugos, right? That's a thing that existed as much as 180 million years ago. But there's gaps in time, and there's gaps in space. We could add big sections out here. Because what don't you see in this list, even of the modern ones, right? What are all of these things have in common? The biggest thing on here is the raccoon. Some aardvarks get decent size. So there's nothing big, nothing. The biggest thing is a beastie called Rapenomamus. And this guy is really, really cool. Look at the size of these teeth. You see these little sharp, veiny, terrifying little monstrosities coming out of the jaw and curving forward in a terrible beast-like manner. And look at the big honking back legs ready to pounce and spring. And we know that this thing was no cute little grass eater because what the heck is this? So here are the ribs, right? Skull is down this end, nice ribs, spinal column, back legs. What's all that? Why do they keep that dirt there? Well, when you zoom in on what's preserved in this region, what part of the body does that look like? The stomach, right? So it's actually the stomach contents. And in this animal stomach were the remains of at least 5 dinosaurs. So this thing was preying on dinosaur nests, pouncing and swallowing dinosaurs whole. Okay? So this is not a calm little beast. This is the biggest mammal that lived for over 150 million years. Terrifying, right? Yeah, they're like the size of a big possum. The baby dinosaurs that they were eating were little teeny things. So it might be mean, but you would just say scat if you saw this thing. Or at very least you'd get a broom, right? The age of the dinosaurs is not a very friendly time to be alive, but mammals are not something you would have to worry about. And the reason that I can say that is because I think we normally think of ourselves as being big, big animals. But we come after this event, right? So this is a computer reconstruction of the impact that caused, or at least contributed to, happen at the same time as the end of the dinosaurs. This is a Yucatan Peninsula. This is where you might go vacation in Mexico today, where the elegant Quechua speakers of the Mayan language still exist. Beautiful rainforest and pyramids. And 66 million years ago, this was ground zero for an explosion 10 times the size of anything you could imagine with all the nuclear weapons that we have on Earth. But it was only after that event that mammals got big. And so we think of ourselves, I think, as pretty typical size. When I think of what's a big animal, you guys might say something like a cow or an elephant or any of the things that are shown on this list that are living, although tenuously in some cases, mammals of today. So when I think of a big animal from the fossil record, you might say, oh, elephants. Elephants are almost always big. But the thing is that that's because we're thinking about this from our perspective. We're thinking, I am normal size. Therefore, things smaller than me are small and things bigger than me are big. But that's sort of not fair either. So this is a crazy diagram showing all of the relationships of all living mammals. And time kind of goes out from the center. So the time at which they split tells you something about when these lineages are diverging, when these families are splitting off and having their kin go off on their own. But all this red here is rodents, teeny little thing of rabbits, some primates, you are here, right? Okay, then there's big animals here. So carnivores, prisodactyls are things like horses and rhinos. Cedardiadactyla is a term that if you want to get really pedantic, I don't particularly agree with, because you can just call them artiodactyls. Those are things with two hooves, pigs, camels, whales. Yeah, whales are in that group. Hippos. So there's some big animals here, and then you go back to tiny. This is all bats. Bats. And then a small group of things that are related to shrews. There's one or two taxa, literally one or two species of organisms over here that are also really big. So elephants are right there. So that means out of all of these species on here, so dense that they look like single colors even though they're all lines, this is all rodent-sized, and this is all tiny bat-sized. These are all shrews, so they're even smaller than the rodents. So when you look at all of mammalian life, almost everything on this entire list I could hold in my hand. In some cases, you might not want to. They're kind of bitey. But I can hold it in my hand. So really, humans are gigantic, right? Can you imagine a world where you are able to be held in the hand of something else? I don't want to live in a world. That's terrifying. That's terrifying to live in a world where something could be like, oh, hi. You know? No, thank you. So I always think about that when I think about my conceptions about how the world works, is that we are actually really large mammals. We are an order of magnitude 10 times larger than the largest things that were running around during the time of the dinosaurs that were our relatives. A maximum body size really does change at the end of the KT, significantly. So, if this is that event, that giant asteroid that wipes out the dinosaurs, the biggest things here only weighed a couple ounces. But by the time, and so this is in log scale, which means that every tick mark you go up is 10 times bigger rather than 1. So by the time you pass over it, you're running into this really quick increase over time until you get to steady state. And can you guess what organism comes around right here to keep the big size? Elephants. So once you get to elephants, they just stay elephant, the largest thing around. So studying this, absolute body size, pretty easy. Because we have great fossil records for mammals. So I can go out into the field and find a fossil, pick it up, and I can say, all right, that's a tooth. How big was the animal that this tooth came from? It's the simplest question in the world, but it's answerable. But if I want to get at anything further, how did this big change in body size occur? I have to dig a little deeper, and it's not immediately apparent how I could figure that out. So one of the things that's most interesting to me as a scientist is not only trying to get at those next questions, but particularly is digging into big biological questions that get at where things come from. And so one thing I want to point out is this concept of the developmental cascading. When you start, everyone I think knows about genes, and then the word phenotype just means like the body of the animal you see. What does the animal look like? What is it doing in its life, right? So genes don't exactly translate to the phenotype. Like you aren't just your genes, clearly. But even animals that don't have our memory and our culture aren't exactly their genes. There's an intervening thing, which is this developmental process. So they have to grow up. Their genes say, start this, and then that starts things that start things that start things until you finally have an organism. So I look at the life as the thing, the individual's growth, as the thing that intervenes between genes and their bodies. And in some ways, when you monkey with either end of this, you end up with evolution. That's a really loose definition of evolution, so don't put that in a report. There's much better definitions, but I really do think it's a useful way of thinking about how you get big changes through time, right? Ultimately, you need to change the genes because that's the thing that you can pass on to your offspring. But if the genes don't change the phenotype, yeah, it's still evolution, but it's not really going to affect where your species is going. So if we want to look at things in the fossil record, if I want to answer this question of how did mammals get big after the death of the dinosaurs, we want to understand why we are big animals. We only have so many records to look at. The best one is the record of animal fossils, which are almost all bones and teeth. So this is an example of what bone looks like when you take it and you put it under a microscope. Bone is really beautiful. It has some really neat things going on. Just to give you like a little tour guide, that is a bone cell. That. This is called osteocytes, and they live in these little cloisters. They're like medieval nuns that have walled themselves in and only have little bits of contact with the outside world. And that contact is these little liney things that you see. It's just like little lines that extend out of each of these little things. Those are called canliculi. Those are little fingers that come out, and they connect the cells to other cells and to these big circles in the middle. And in life, those big circles would have a blood vessel and nerve in it. And so that's where your body, every time your heart beats, is going to send oxygen out to all these cells. Worth talking about this because I want to impinge upon you that bone is not stones inside of us. I think a lot of times that's just how you think about it. I'm alive and my skeleton is a dead thing that lives inside me. Bone is so alive. And I love bone because it is this living, changing organ. So bone is, you can have a bone that you could call femur, right? That's a bone. You have bone, the tissue, which is this is a picture of. But also the skeletal system, the bones, are really a big organ. And so what I study is not just the fossil bones and their outside morphology, which I love, but what they look like on the inside and what that can tell us about how the animal lived and grew and made its way in the world. So here's that developmental cascade again. And bone is great for this because it keeps a record, even after the animal is dead. In its tissues, it keeps the record of this middle thing, which kind of lets me make a link between the phenotype I can see from the bones and the genes that are lost. You can't recover that from the fossil. So how do I find this out? Well, I do something that museum people are always hesitant to let me do, which is I actually cut up the fossils themselves. So this is the back legs of a brand new species of dinosaur that I described. And this is 124 million years old, and I took a Dremel drill to it, and I cut its leg in half. I cut this whole segment out. And then I took it back to the United States with me, and I put a perfect cast of it in its place. So I'll take a second to tell you how we do that. It's kind of interesting. Once I've cut the specimen, I'll be left with a piece of bone. So this is like, I have this bone and I want to see about this animal's growth. I could take a saw. I could cut this section right here out. And I'd be left with something that looked like that. And then I would take this and I'd make a mold and cast of it with flexible rubber. And then I could pour a polymer or some other sort of thing, plaster of Paris in here, and make a copy. If I can actually pass this around, you guys could play with it. This is from another dinosaur, and I know I'm supposed to be talking about mammals, I'm sorry. But this is the leg bone of a dinosaur that was pregnant when we found it. So it actually had eggs inside its stomach, so we could learn a lot about how dinosaurs had their young. It was also from China, like this dinosaur. But I wanted to sample because I wanted to see how old was this dinosaur when it was first having laid eggs. Did it have any other signals of being pregnant, etc.? Rapid. And so we wanted to cut it up, but we couldn't just cut this hard dinosaur off, so we made a perfect cast of it. They could put it back on the specimen and have it for display. And then the results that we get are beautiful slides like this. So this is all sediment, the brown stuff at the top. that is a cross-section of the fibula, which is your lower outer leg bone, skinny. And then this is a cross-section of the tibia, which is your shin bone that you might bonk in the middle of the night if you tried to move around without turning the lights on. This dinosaur looked like it bonked its shin bone really hard, but that's actually just from the preservation over millions of years. It got crushed as the layers preserved it. We zoom in, we can see some really cool details. And so we can see almost all of the structures in this 120 million year old dinosaur bone that I showed you on the modern bone in that previous slide. Here are those places where the blood vessels are. Each one of those little teeny dots is where the bone cell lived. And you can, even if you zoom in further, see those little canaliculi that connect them all up. So what can we learn from bone? I'll use an example. I'll try to give you like comparisons that I find are good shorthand for understanding how we learn these things. The first example I'll start with is one that my coworker, Dr. Sarah Werning, always uses, which is you can look at a bone and tell whether relative to another bone it was growing quickly or slowly. And kind of the thing that I always say here is I can build you a house, and I can build it, you can have it fast and cheap, or you can have it cheap and well-made, or you can have it fast and well-made, but you can't have all three, right? Her example is, if I need to put all this stuff in my room, in my closet, I can do it quickly and have it look like a mess, or I can have it look real nice, but I can't do it in time for my in-laws to come home, right? So that idea of how you can do something quick and well-organized, those two things are in conflict with one another, and so you really end up with something that happens slowly and well-organized or quickly and poorly organized, works amazingly in bone. So we can tell the relative speed at which bone develops. There's another thing called, I'm going to give you there's some terms here, so they'll come back. Line of arrested growth is like tree rings. So here's the bark of the tree, and then each of these rings is a year. You guys have heard of that before, right? So bone, you may not know this, but bone grows in a very comparable fashion. The bones of dinosaurs, bones of mammals, every year there's a point at which they hormonally, this is just something that vertebrates do, animals with bones just do this, slow down and put down a layer or a stopped moment in their growth that you can detect when you look at their bones in cross-section. So those are called lines of arrested growth, and I can count those and get a yearly count of a minimum age for the animal, at least 5, at least 2. There's another thing called the EFS. So the EFS is around the outside. If you kind of look at this picture, which is again not a bone, this is a tree, but as a metaphor, the bark on the outside doesn't grow the same way that bone does, but you know that when you are done building your house, then you can paint it, because it's the exterior. So when bone is done growing, it's not going to put down any more of those lags. It's not going to get any thicker, any bigger. Then they start to lay down this layer of tight little lines on the outside. So they kind of paint the outside of the bone. I know that's just an analogy. And then the last thing you can learn from bones is a microanatomy. Is a bone really dense? Are the walls really thin? Are there lots of struts of bone where the marrow cavity would be? Or is it completely filled in? Is it really hollow? And so just in general, there's a tight correlation, in some cases, between how the bone is organized, where is the bone tissue in my bone organ, and what that animal's using the bone for. So those are the tools. So to sort of put those all in one thing, here's a really pretty bone. This is a cut I made of the back leg of a fossil whale. So I don't know how much you know this story, and I don't have time to really go into a lot of detail. If you want to ask me about it later, please do. Whales, as I sort of teased about before, are descended from relatives of cows and sheep and pigs. So those animals had 4 legs, so whales' ancestors, we hypothesized, would have had 4 legs. So it turned out that when we finally found really, really old whales, they did have back legs. And so I got access to the femur, same bone and almost the same size as this, which is from a deer. And I cut it up. So this is what it looks like on the inside, and there's almost no marrow cavity. It's really filled in, so it's really dense bone, and there are these rings, annuli. And so this whale may have actually taken up to 18 years to get to this size, but we're not talking modern whale size. Actually, there are some really small modern whales. The cute little almost extinct vaquita is like this big. But when you think of a whale size, our metaphor is like the big whales, humpback whales, blue whales. And this is not that size. So whales had already, even when they were relatively small, started this slow languid growth phase of their lives. So that's just an example of the kind of thing you can figure out. Also, if it's hard to conceptualize that microanatomy, where's the bone in my bone idea, the fact that this doesn't have a lot of open space is important because whales, one of the things that they're doing at certain times in their evolution is trying to have a really dense bone so that they can operate better in the water. That makes a lot of sense. Whales in the modern times have sort of reversed that trend. They kind of have really light bones because that helps them stay buoyant. But the point is you mess with the density of your bone when you're going into a new environment. You're starting to learn how to fly. You're starting to learn how to live in the ocean. So we can learn a lot of things, bottom line, about the growth, the development, and even the physiology, how metabolically active you are from your bones themselves. So a couple of quick case studies. I'm going to rush through these pretty quickly. This is some of my own research, but I hope that you'll find this sort of stuff interesting. Is if we want to understand how mammals got big, we might want to look at what are the first big mammals? How did they grow? And were they bizarre? It turns out, of course, they're bizarre. Coryphodon is one of my favorite animals. I like unloved things, and Coryphodon is definitely an unloved organism. During the Bone Wars, you might have heard about this in the late 1800s. There was big scientists who were trying to get big specimens, the Carnegie Museum and the American Museum, right? They wanted these big specimens to bring in, to bring honor to people like Peabody and the rich robber barons names who are funding this stuff, but also to get people in the door. So they really competed with one another. And this was actually an animal that was fought over like tooth and nail. And these really stuffy scientific journals, these scientists were calling each other like, I don't understand how anyone could come to these ridiculous conclusions, really in formal language, really throwing the hat down. But it's essentially been forgotten since then. Very interesting animal, bizarre skeleton, super graviportal, bizarre giant head with huge fangy things and this weird dish-shaped skull and teeth back. And they're really, really commonly reconstructed as very hippopotamus-like. Look at it. Put it next to a pond. Made the feet real big, right? They don't cover it in hair, which you wouldn't know. So they're implying in this drawing, this is a great artist, Charles Knight, implying that this is a semi-aquatic animal. It's under which you first get really big, because this is right after the death of the dinosaurs. It seems like a long time, but 5 to 10 million years later, you already have animals that are this big. That's big. So we'll see how much this works. This is going from the inside of the bone outside, but zoomed in. This is a really big bone. This section is this big. That's the size of its femur. All the way to the outside. And finally out here, we start to pick up those lags, those lines I told you about. So I can get a sense of how old it was at a minimum, but maybe there's a lot of bone lost in here. And this is actually really bizarre bone. Look at this. Crazy shapes. There's those are those blood vessels, but there's not a lot of them. It's really filled in. That's a bubble. That's me screwing up. You can run it. Really strange bone. And then this isn't that important, but the point is you have this really bizarre bone on the inside, and then sort of a transitional period back out to normal bone on the outside. And it's just not something we see very commonly. Maybe to give you something that is easier to pick up with your eye, here's a comparison. So this is a rib of a horse. And you can see it has an outer layer and an inner layer where there'd be marrow. That's this. If you eat ribs, we're going to horse ribs, but if you eat ribs and you look at the side of your rib when you're done, it's going to look exactly like this. And zoomed in, you have this is filled in with dirt, you have this trabeculae of bone, and marrow or whatever would be in the middle. But this is Coryphodon. Look at it. There's no marrow cavity. There's barely any space at all for anything in there. And when you zoom in, instead of seeing a lot of empty space or filled in space and really narrow little bridges, it's just full and there's only tiny little openings. Really different looking. So you say, maybe this thing doesn't live like a horse lives. And we can sort of highlight that by making this only 2 colors. But if you compare this to another really bizarre animal, which is, you guys have heard of a sloth? So sloths are the last little remnants living today of a lineage that had a bunch of other really crazy things in it. I don't know if Nick's going to talk about giant sloths too much, but giant sloths were around when people were around, and giant sloths, including in the Bay Area. So when they were digging the subway tunnel in downtown Berkeley, they found the arm and leg bones of a giant sloth, and this bone, the humerus, is this big. Yeah, so giant sloths were almost the size of Indian elephants. They would not really have been comfortable in a room this small, right? They had huge claws. There's a lot more storytelling I can do there, but the point is, and this is even taking something weird and making it weirder, is that back in the day, there were groups of them that became aquatic, went back to the ocean. So not only do you have giant sloth, you have a giant sloth that lives in the sea, but the point is, when you look at their ribs, that looks a heck of a lot more like that than that horse rib does. And so we can quantify this by looking at the density moving from the inside to the outside. It's about 40% bone on the inside, out to like 95% bone on the outside. And that's this exact signal that you get with animals that live in shallow water. Hippos are close to this, giant sloths are similar to this, even sea otters are approaching this style of microanatomy. And so we can use this information to give us a sense of the microstructure. And histology is a study of bone tissues, that's what I do. We can use these two things here, in addition to these other main ways of thinking about things, as part of getting at the ecological or behavioral information of the animals that are long, long gone. We can't watch behave. Okay, so another example of trying to understand this. So we might ask about what are the weird first mammals, what are they doing? We might also ask about, okay, what mammals we're familiar with. How did they get to their position today? So if we look at one group, the meat eaters, I did it again. This picture I showed you at the beginning, the diversity of mammals on it, I don't know if you noticed, but everything on here has a meat-eating mammal on it. So this looks like a crazy amount of diversity, but it's actually only a tiny fragment of that big wheel of species that I showed you. And they do a crazy diversity of things. We have, pinnipeds, seals, and sea lions live in the ocean. We have marine bears, crazy, really flexible plant-eating mammals, communal living things that warn each other predators are coming, hyper-carnivorous, beautiful Las Vegas dwelling meat eaters, things that live in packs, occasionally things that fly, although that's, I think, not typical. And then our little commensal friends. Yeah, so that's actually like a stoat or a little ferret-like animal that's attacking this woodpecker. And it does not, you can tell how happy he is about it. I don't think it ended well, particularly for either of them. But so my point here is, that's all just this little group, carnivora, right? Meat eaters. Then there are stem things that are on the road to being carnivores, but they're sisters to all of the living ones put together. So they're not in that crown, right? It's like a low branch off of this tree that now is all the leaves are on the top. And then there's this whole other thing, which isn't included at all. This thing looks like somebody made it up. But this is Hyenodon, which is one of the last and one of the largest North American members of a group called the Creodonts. So this crazy thing with this big head. So modern living, your cat or your dog, when you look in the mouth, they have these blades for cutting up meat. These guys actually evolved 2 blades in the back of their mouth for doing the same thing. They independently came upon similar ways of being a meat eater. And they really dominated for a long time. Here's just a sort of a tree-like diagram to show you what they're related to. So here's modern living carnivores, and those like stems are these branches off. And then creodonts are sisters. So they're close, right? But they're not in the same group. And if you look at, this is just a diagram to show to compare the dominance of these two meat-eating groups. So this one that's high here in the earlier part, so this line again is 66 million years ago, after the dinosaurs. And this cuts off about halfway to the present, 30-something million years here. So for the very first period, the first really popular, relatively diverse group of North American meat eaters, worldwide meat eaters really, is the creodonts, big-headed guys, and they precipitously go down and then are immediately replaced by the circles here, which are the carnivores. So that's always been a big question is, okay, well, if one goes out and the other comes in, are they competing? It's a really hard question to answer, and some parts of that question have been knocked down. But one suggestion was maybe one of them grows really slowly. They look like they move slow, they're dumb, etc. And then modern men, living carnivores are super fast. Come in and they can jump on woodpecker. So I was very lucky to get hold of the bones of a number of these different taxa and compare them. And here we get to use the method of the empty closet, as well as the lags, counting those number of yearly rings that they lay down. And so this is the big leg bone of this guy. And you can see this thing took 1 billion years to grow. Every one of these lines is a year, almost every one of these lines. And you look at it under different light, and you can see that it grows. Would you call this a clean closet or a messy closet? What do you think? Most of this bone is real messy. This is pretty fast-growing, crazy bone. Now, there's the possibility this is a different type of bone. We can go into that in more detail, but essentially, that's your first signal is that some of this bone is growing really quickly. Some of this bone looks pretty organized. So I don't know what the answer is, but I can count the years, and it seems that to become an adult takes at least 6 years for this big animal. Modern lions are full adult size in under 3 years, right? So when the male comes in and has cubs, and then the male's, like Simba grows up to challenge his uncle, right? That's less than 2 years. So the Hakuna Matata song, that's a 2-year song. But this guy, in order to get slightly smaller even than an African lion, had more than at least 6 years. That's really slow growth for that outer part of this. It was growing like a wild monster when it was really young, and then slowed way the heck down to get the body size. It's really, really different from even the early carnivore relatives. Really fast, 1 to 2 years, and living, still really old, 20 million year old, but fully within modern carnivores, 1 or 2 years. So it looks like small stem carnivores, those Myasidae things, are still growing pretty slow because they're tiny, but they're well on their way to acting like modern carnivores. And even though carnivores did grow really, really slowly, they're so much bigger in comparison that we can't really believe the idea. You can actually kind of reject the idea that they're growing really all that much more slowly than those early Myasids, carnivore relatives. So again, I'm happy to answer further questions about that or clarify anything, but the key is that histology can be used to eliminate both what animals are doing with their lives and how they grew, how they get to that body size. So both where they come from and how they do what they do. And there's so much more to talk about. Like, this is a more graphic version of that thing that I talked about in the past. So I haven't talked about any of the tiny animals. I haven't talked about any of the our close relatives, any of the monkeys or apes. And then, I haven't talked about the elephants, which, as I pointed out, are the thing that is the big thing forever. I just talked about things that are right here. So there's a lot of the kingdom of mammals to explore with this question, and a lot of the Age of Mammals that we don't really know very much about. But the key is that really quickly after the death of the dinosaurs, we have this rise of large-bodied mammal forms that become the norm for all the rest of this time until the present, or at least so close to the present. And with that teaser, I'll give you guys 5 seconds for a breather, and we'll pass it on to Nick.
Thank you for that segue, Ash. All right, real quick, can anyone in the back not hear me? Or a little trouble? Good. All right. Good on that. Good on vision. All right. Okay. Well, firstly, I just wanted to say thank you all for coming here and watching us talk and present this to you. We really appreciate your presence and your time to spend your evening with us. I also wanted to thank Wonderfest and all the people involved with Wonderfest for inviting us to come out here and give our talks. We really appreciate this opportunity. And with that wonderful setup from Ash, I will continue on with my half of the talk. So what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit about the ecology of big animals. Ash largely talked about the evolution of big animals, how they got big in the first place. And I'm going to talk about what makes big animals special in terms of how they interact with their environment. I'll move on then to what looks like a typo on the screen, but I mean it. The idea of what is happening And what I'm getting at with that is ideas about what has happened in recent geologic time are part of a broader continuum of what is happening today, especially in the case of extinctions. And I'll wrap it up with the idea of what does it mean? If we're trying to learn things about animals that are large and endangered today, what can we get at from these prehistoric animals that might be able to help us out? And with that, if you have any very pressing questions or things you want to chime in with, or if there's anything that's really confusing about the slides, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, we'll be taking questions at the end. So to start, one really interesting thing that big animals do, especially big herbivores, is they make trees become more spiny. Now, we can see here, there we go, is a giraffe casually browsing on this branch, eating lunch. But if we look closer in on that branch, we see that that branch has extremely large spines about the length of your finger. That is an acacia bush, and this giraffe is actually being very meticulous about where it bites down on the branch so that it only gets leaves and it doesn't accidentally pierce its tongue. If we look at this relationship through time, here is a graph showing on the y-axis the logarithmic value of the number of lineages, that is not so much distinct species, but more so different branches on the tree of life. And on the x-axis, we have age in millions of years before present, older going towards the left, younger going towards the right. And we have three different lines, including the non-spiny plant lineages, normal plants, you can think of them that way. The red line at the bottom is spiny plant lineages, and the blue line towards the end on the bottom right is bobbed lineages, which includes things like antelope that we know are browsers today and have been browsers in the past. So if we look at non-spiny plant lineages, they are just kind of doing their thing and diversifying, increasing the number of branches they have on their branch on the tree of life over the past 140 million years. If we look at spiny plants in particular, though, they are just hanging out, not doing much of anything until about 40 million years ago, and then they really take off around 20 million years ago, right around the time that bobbed lineages, or these antelopes, start browsing on them. And the argument here is that this is very much so a causal relationship where the antelopes are saying, hey, look, a free lunch, and the plants are saying, no, that is my organ that I need to survive. Please stop eating me. I'm going to grow these things so that you stop. Another idea that big animals do is they make landscapes become more open. So here we have a very picturesque landscape showing some horses, some deer in the background, a nice hazy sunset, very reminiscent of an African savanna. However, where do you think this landscape is from? Oregon. Maybe Oregon, but actually this is not Africa at all. This is the Netherlands. I mean, definitely not a place that I would guess. But what is happening here is this is actually a giant project going on where a lot of land managers are actively taking large herbivores and putting them in this landscape to see what happens. And what happens is all the grassy stuff you can see in the foreground here is directly a result of these large herbivores being large herbivores. By that I mean they're grazing, they're trampling small seedlings of trees, they're making sure that new trees aren't growing. And if we're to test this experimentally, we can see on the right here, we have an aerial view of an experiment from Kruger National Park in South Africa. And what we can see on the top, this squarish area up here, this is an area where large herbivores are totally excluded from. And so all of the kind of cotton candy, confetti-looking dots on here are all trees, full-grown trees. And all of the area outside of that, you can see, is almost completely open. Now the interesting thing is that the area inside and out both is about the same amount of rainfall and the same amount of fire in terms of controlled burns going on. And so when you have large herbivores on a landscape, they totally strip the landscape of most of the trees happening there. And we can infer that this has been happening for tens of millions of years. Interestingly, I was watching a TED Talk last night to try to prepare myself and get an idea for how very professional speakers talk about ecology, and realized that, wait a minute, there's the TED Talk that I was watching was on this study exactly. So if you like this kind of thing, I highly advise checking out the TED Talk on ecology from the air. And another interesting thing about landscapes becoming more open is that we have a way from geology and from paleontology of trying to directly observe these large herbivore behaviors through time. So what we're looking at here is known as a pollen diagram. And what it is representing is the idea of, let's say you go out on a lake, it's a beautiful day, might be totally rainy, but it's field work, and you go out with a plastic tube, and you take that tube and you stick it in the bottom of the lake, and you pull out the mud and sand from the bottom, just like a piston, just like taking a straw and a drink, putting your finger on top and pulling the liquid out of it. And so with that core, we have older things at the bottom and younger things on top, and we can get itty bitty tiny bits of pollen and different types of pollen from these cores and get a sense of what the vegetation looked like around that lake through time. So on the x-axis here we have concentrations of different types of plants. On the y-axis we have the age in thousands of years before present. Again, oldest stuff is at the bottom, youngest stuff is on top. And we have different types of plants around this landscape in Indiana through time. We have conifers like pines, spruces. We have deciduous trees like ashes, birches, and oaks. And then on the far right, we have the concentration of charcoal in this core, which we can say, okay, there are itty bitty tiny bits of charcoal, and if we count them up, we can get a rough sense of how intense fires were around this area through time. And we have one more interesting thing called sporamiella. Sporamiella is this tiny itty bitty little fungus. These are the spores of it. That scale bar is looking at 20 micrometers. That is 20 millionths of a meter. And the interesting thing about this fungus is that it grows on poop. And the idea with that is that if you have more of these spores in your lake sediment record, that means you had more poop around the landscape. And if you had more poop around the landscape, that means you had more large herbivores. So some of these large herbivores, especially in the case of Indiana, included mastodons and mammoths. And a very interesting thing that comes out from this study is that if we look around 14,000 years ago, we see some major changes happening in the vegetation and the ecosystem around this lake. We see the amount of spruce starting to decline at the expense, or conversely, we see a lot of these deciduous trees taking off, ashes, birches, and oaks really starting to come into the scene, and later on, charcoal really takes off. And so, what paleontologists usually do when they see something like this is say, oh, we know that climate was changing at the same time, and plants change with climate change, and so climate change was causing these changes. However, in this part of the world at this time, we were actually going through a particularly cold snap. And so, it's a little bit contradictory to think, okay, why are spruces doing worse when things are getting colder, and things that we know, like it when it gets warmer, ashes, birches, oaks, other deciduous trees, are actually taking off when things are getting colder. This is totally backwards. However, if we look at landscapes today, especially in the case of elephants, one of my favorite statistics is that if you take an adult male African elephant and put him in a forest, on average, he will kill about 100 trees per individual per year. And that's just by virtue of him being an elephant, knocking trees over to get the leaves on the top, trampling seedlings, and just romping around. We can then suggest that, well, mammoths, evolutionarily speaking, are also elephants, so they're probably doing elephant-like things. So what's not to say that around the same time that we lose these mammoths and mastodons, what we're seeing is the exact same thing happening with these African landscapes, but in reverse, where the loss of these animals is changing the landscape around this lake and the ecological functions of all of these things and how they work at the same scale that climate change causes changes, which is a very, very interesting concept, but it all hinges upon the assumption that this dung fungus here is actually telling us something about how many large herbivores are around the lake, which is an assumption that is largely untested, but I am testing it for my dissertation. So if you'd like to chat about that, I'm more than happy to. And so, as we've been talking about, and as Ash was talking about, this has been the norm for tens of millions of years. You get enough elephants around a tree, they'll literally gore it and kill it and turn woodlands into grasslands within a matter of years. Yeah.
The picture on the right shows what's left of the tree on the left.
Effectively, yeah. So the question was, the tree on the right shows what happened to the tree on the left. So it is a different tree, but about the same size. So yeah, what happens is elephants, especially in the dry season, love eating baobab trees, which is the tree we're looking at, because they have a particularly high concentration of water. And their wood is very soft, and so they just take their tusks and gore the tree to death to get that nice, wet, hippie wood. And they will do this, and they'll turn an entire baobab forest into a grassland in a matter of years, which is pretty wild. Likewise, in the case of white rhinos, is another big animal. They will actually act as nature's lawnmowers and graze down these landscapes to such a level that only very, very, very short species of grasses can grow. And other animals, like wildebeest, I don't know why that advanced, like wildebeest, like zebra, like impala, love these open landscapes, and this fundamentally changes the behavior of fire as it goes through the landscape. And I'm sure these examples are ringing some bells for you about the idea of wolves in Yellowstone, namely that as wolves have been reintroduced to Yellowstone, the entire ecosystem has radically changed, because as wolves were brought in, they were predating more on elk, and elk populations, as soon as they got back down to some idea of natural levels, the willow trees that were growing, or trying to grow on the floodplains next to the streams, were then lost because you didn't have as many elk browsing upon them, and there's been some incredible top-down effects of wolves acting in these landscapes. So, big animals make the world go round. For tens of millions of years, they've been doing that. But about 50,000 years ago, something changed. And that something was us, as another big animal that popped into the scene. Around 50,000 years ago, when we look at some fossils from South Africa, we see some of the first appearance of very sophisticated stone tools. We see scrapers, chisels, some different implements used for processing meat, presumably. We also see some very interesting things where we have these parallel lines that are a little bit equal to each other, equidistant to each other, very sophisticated and very hard to explain by natural processes. So the idea is what we're looking at in South Africa at this time is the oldest known example of abstract art. Likewise with these shells that have these holes in them, those holes did not get there from natural predators or from something else happening naturally to the shellfish. These are likely the oldest known jewelry. And so around 50,000 years ago, we see some major technological, economic, cognitive advances in Homo sapiens that led us to having a foundation that would later allow us to spread all around the world. So here's a map of the world showing the old world on the left. We have Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia, and then the new world on the right with North and South America. And as we look at the spread of human migration, some interesting things pop up. So as we came out of East Africa, around the same time, here's again that those artifacts showing our cognitive advances. We spread into the Arabian Peninsula and acted as beachcombers going around southern Asia. We then skirted down into what is now Australia. The animal icons that you're looking at on the screen are showing how many different genera, which is a plural of genus, became extinct right around the same time that people arrived. So in the case of Australia, this icon is showing 21 different genera and is showing what's called a diprotodon, which is a rhino-sized wombat that lived in Australia up until about 45,000 years ago. Pretty wild. And around the same time, about 45,000 years ago, we see the earliest appearances of Homo sapiens in Europe. A very cool example of this is some cave lion deposits that we see in northern Spain. Now, cave lions are very close cousins to African lions. They were alive in Europe and Asia up until about 12,000 years ago. Here we have an example from northern Spain of some bones, especially toe bones, that were found in the cave to suggest that, one, they were butchered by Homo sapiens, by people, and two, they were butchered in such a way to keep the claws attached to the soft tissue associated with the skeleton, suggesting that these cats were actively being processed to make pelts. Now, we don't know if these pelts were used, say, just to stay warm in the Ice Age, or whether they were status symbols, but regardless, I think that's probably one of the coolest things I've heard of, and I may never be that cool. But we then continued northward along the eastern coast of Asia. Around 30,000 years ago, we find a rib bone from an elephant, not just a mammoth, but elephants that used to live in Japan. This is about 30,000 years old, and you can see just in this tiny red box, we have a tiny bit of flint that is very sharp and embedded in the rib bone of the elephant. And this is very hard to explain naturally because there's no other evidence of the bone being trampled to suggest that perhaps maybe this elephant died and his bones got stepped on and pressed into the dirt, and maybe some rock fragments got stuck into the rib that way. So this suggests that these elephants in Japan 30,000 years ago were also actively being hunted. Here is the woolly rhino that was advertised with this talk. And about 13,000 years ago, we see this, which is a woolly rhino horn, but is much sharper than natural woolly rhino horns. And this is sharp on both ends. That doesn't happen, really. This is a spear made from woolly rhino horn. And it's very plausible to suggest that it was used for hunting woolly rhino around the same time. As we made our way across the Bering Land Bridge, which was where the Bering Strait was, is today, but was not covered in water at the time, we see evidence about 14,000 years ago in North America. Here we have a rib fragment, and here we have a tiny little tip right there of a very sharp piece of another rib embedded within the bone. Again, this is very weird because it begs the question, well, how did that happen? Was it just some pathological thing where it just grew a sharp little bone spur sticking out of it? But when a group analyzed this bone and saw some of the 3D internal structure of it, it turns out that that is a very much a sharp fragment of the bone that has been embedded in there. So what this means is somebody was actively hunting mastodon, killed a mastodon, or perhaps found a mastodon that had already passed away, took its rib, and then killed another mastodon with that piece of the mastodon. Which is a fantastic way to add insult to injury. As we're looking in eastern North America, we can see littered all across the landscape thousands of arrowheads. And these arrowheads around this time have a very distinctive shape to them that has a fluted structure, where there are two little channels running along the length of these arrowheads. For a really long time, archaeologists thought that, oh, this was mostly decorative. However, as this person is showing, there's a lab in Kent State in Ohio that did a study showing that when you have these fluted arrowheads, those arrowheads are actually much less likely to shatter upon impact. Meaning that if you're going to be hunting using those arrowheads, you don't have to find a nice rock to make a new arrowhead every time you want to eat dinner. And lastly, about 15,000 years ago, we made our way into South America, which coincided with the extinction of about 50 different genera of big animals. Big animal we're looking at here, whoops. This one is known as a glyptodon. It is a cousin to armadillos today, but it is about the size of a VW beetle that humans ran into. Now, I don't know how big the ones in South America were. We do know that there were ones in North America, and especially Texas, and I think it's safe to assume that the ones in Texas were probably bigger than the ones in South America. So, it's quite the coincidence that all of these things happen right around the same time that people show up, right? But we know that we were coming out of the last ice age at this time. We know that global warming has caused previous prehistoric extinctions. We know that some of the mass extinctions that wiped out at least 75% of all species have been caused, partially at least, by global warming. We know that large animal populations, large mammals in particular, have contracted during warm phases in between the peaks of ice ages. And so we've had about 20 different ice age events that cycle back and forth over the past about 2.5 million years. And we know from some genes that we have gotten from bone preserved in permafrost, which is the world's largest outdoor freezer, conveniently, that these large mammals get really stressed out when things get warmer. They're big, they're fuzzy, they don't like it when things get hot. And we know that mammals today are migrating further north, such as this example right here. This is a man who has recently hunted a bear. Now, what kind of bear would you say this is? Polar bear, something like that. But it looks a little different, right? It's a little bit more brown than you would expect out of a polar bear. So, what we're looking at here, this is not just a polar bear, but this is a roller bear, also known as a Paisley bear. That is a hybrid between a polar bear and a grizzly bear. Grizzly bears are migrating further and further north today, very much coincident with climate change. And they are interbreeding with polar bears because they are making it that far north. Now, this is interesting both from the sense of how climate change affects ecology, but it's also very interesting because the man in this photo had a permit to hunt grizzly bear. However, polar bears are an endangered species and thus are federally protected. So we run into some very interesting legal issues about what we call it. So paleontologists, geologists, and archaeologists have been arguing about the past 60 years saying, oh, there's no way people with sticks and spears and arrows could hunt these species to extinction. Totally was climate change. We know it's done before. But then we look at how climate has changed in the past and how human populations have really taken off and societies changed. And people from the archaeology community were saying it was totally people overhunting them and people were really butting heads back and forth. And now we're finally at the intellectual stage in this argument, 60 years after we really got started, where we can say, well, why not both, right? Here we have a graph showing climate change through time. X-axis is thousands of years before present, from about 20,000 to today. The y-axis is showing temperature change in degrees Fahrenheit compared to 1960 to 1990. Now the LGM over here, that stands for the last glacial maximum. It's about the last time in Earth's history that things got really, 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 really cold. And since then, from about 20,000 years to 10-ish thousand years, we run into what's called the Holocene, which you can see temperature is both warmer and much more stable than it has been before. So most of these extinctions of big animals in more recent geologic time have happened in this window from about 20,000 to 10,000. However, as I was just showing, we know that we have sites where we have pretty clear evidence that people were hunting these animals. So it's very much likely that it was a 1-2 punch model, where we know the animals get stressed out, things get really warm, especially very quickly, and then very sophisticated hunters in the form of Homo sapiens arrive on the scene. And compared to other phases where things got warm, then we have all these extinctions happening. Now that begs the question, too, of where would we find these big animals if these extinctions didn't happen? Here we have two different maps showing where we find giraffe size and larger herbivores today, mostly in Africa, compared to where we would find them if these extinctions around 50,000 years ago never really happened. You see, interestingly, there are some huge hotspots. Warmer colors indicate more species in South America, in the American Southwest, in Europe. Likewise, if we do the same thing for things that are about say, deer size to giraffe size. We see a lot of them in Africa today, but compared to the past, they used to be pretty much everywhere, especially North America, South America, spread across Asia. We see the same thing for carnivores too. Anything from about the size of a full-grown Siberian husky or bigger used to be about everywhere on Earth. So, with these things happening in combination, begs the question: what's happening? It's the question.
The graphs you were showing, these are showing number of species as opposed to number of animals?
Correct. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. The question was whether these maps are showing the number of species compared to the number of animals. I don't know why that keeps progressing, but yes. So this is showing the diversity of how many different types of species you have, not just population densities. Great question. So getting back to the question of what's happening, or how these things in recent geologic time relate to how things are going today, we know in a general sense that when people arrive in an area, things get smaller. Here we have two conch shells. One of them is from Panama on the Caribbean side, right before people showed up, and here are conches today from Panama. This study showed that conch today are about 40% smaller than when people first arrived in the area. Oops. Likewise, we can see that coyotes, although they're still around today, they used to be much larger in terms of the width of their thigh bones and how elongate or stout, relatively speaking, their jaw bones were. And if we're going to plot this and compare through time, what we have is a set of histograms showing the distribution of different body masses of different animals. So we have smaller things on the left, bigger things on the right. The values in each of these are looking at, as Ash was getting at, the giant ground sloth over here. This is probably the most adorable restoration of a giant ground sloth I've ever seen before, too. The Pleistocene extinct just means animals that have become extinct during the last ice ages, anywhere from 2.5 million to 11,000 years ago. Anthropocene, in this case, is referring to anything from the year 1500 to today. Here we see the Tasmanian tiger or wolf. Here we have an ocelot, which is a cat larger than a house cat, but not like a jaguar or anything that lives in South America. And here we have tiny little mice. So we can see a pretty clear trend looking at these values indicating medians for these distributions, that if you are bigger, you are at much higher risk of becoming extinct compared to if you're smaller, you're not really threatened today. Now, the author of this study, Rodolfo Dirzo, he is a professor at Stanford. He is concerned that if we keep this up, what we will ultimately run into is what he calls the rodentification of the world, where most of the animals that are going to be around are about the size of a squirrel or a rat. Maybe a capybara, if we get lucky. But if we take this trend and we project it forward for about, say, the next 200 years, excluding humans, what do you think is going to be the biggest animal on Earth?
Nice. In natural environment or even in even on farms?
On farms?
Whales?
Whales?
Oh, good point.
Possibly. So even with the although we do have whales left today, a lot of them are threatened with extinction. So if we keep up business as usual, the last large animal that's going to be left on Earth in 200 years is going to be a cow. That means no more whales, no more elephants, or rhinos, no more hippos, none of that.
Bears?
No bears, no tigers. Man. And it's very possible to look at the, we can look at this from the perspective of how much mass these animals are taking too. This is a very interesting graph showing on the x-axis we have the logarithmic value of years before present. We have older things from 100,000 years ago to today. Y-axis we have the biomass, or the mass of all of the animals in these groups in kilograms. The red line is showing megafauna, which is a term for animals over 100 pounds, showing both ones that are extinct and ones that are alive today on the red line. And if we compare that with the biomass of humans in the blue line, we see from about 100,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, we had more wild big animals around than we did people. However, since we're out about the dawn of agriculture 10,000 years ago, combined with these extinctions, human biomass has surpassed that of wild big animal biomass. So what we're doing, if this is true, is we're literally taking the mass that made these wild animals and turning it into us. Turning it into our skin, our clothes, our hair, our beard. All of these things were once wild animals. We have become them.
Biomass takes into account the numbers of individuals, total mass of all the humans, versus total mass of all other,
right?
All other fauna. Mm-hmm. Maybe not even insects too. Everything.
So this is just for animals larger than 100 pounds. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there used to be this statistic, if I can
sure.
Quick. But when I was a kid, they talked about, well, what if you added up all the ants in the world? How much would they weigh? And now it turns out that us and our domestic animals probably are reaching or exceeding the mass of all the ants in the world too. So these trends, although this is just for animals larger than 40 kilograms or so, that's a trend that is not confined just to large animals.
Yeah. So that was a great question about whether we're looking at the biomass of all wild animals, but this is just showing wild animals that are over 100 pounds from the Ice Age to today. So if we look at the situation, it doesn't look so hot. Here we have 3 maps showing the historic distribution in blue and the current distribution in red of 3 very charismatic African animals: the African elephant, the common hippo, and the black rhino. And for all of these, we can see that their ranges today compared to the past are much smaller. The situation is so bad for black rhinos especially, that these red little patches showing where black rhinos are, those aren't even real. And by that, I mean the authors of this study actually randomly generated where those red patches are, because if you are a savvy poacher, you know you can just look, get a subscription to one of these journals and say, hey, these scientists are doing my work for me and showing me where I can find a black rhino, get his horn. That's how bad that situation is. So to end on a more positive note, what does this mean for saving the last big animals? Now we have this saying in geology that goes, if something did happen, it could happen. Now we're not the best at sayings in geology, but what that is really getting at in this case is, if we know that global warming and overhunting have caused extinctions of big animals in the past, we know that those are very legitimate reasons for concern with big animals today and could cause them to ultimately become extinct. And as I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, when we're looking at these big, nice, beautiful open landscapes full of things like African elephants, we know that if we lose them, it's entirely possible that they will become shrubby, more woody, and very different to what we'd like. And that's especially important in the case of Africa, because a lot of sub-Saharan African countries receive incredible income and revenue through the safari industry, the tourism industry. So this could have major economic implications if we keep going at the same rate and lose more and more of these big animals as we know them. So we know that the world used to look like this. We used to have mammoths running around. Maybe not all of these animals concentrated at one point. All these different things. And I'm just going to turn off the microphone for a second to show my prop. We also know locally, can anyone hear me? Not hear me? Good. Okay. Locally, we had things to inspire wonder, such as this. This is a fragment of a mammoth tusk. A fragment, not the whole thing, just a chunk. And
from Oakland. These were walking around in what is now Oakland up until about, say, 11,000 years ago. Some of the first people in the Bay Area saw these animals alive. They had their domesticated dogs with them. Dogs had been domesticated by this point. They had language. They had culture. They had very nice. Why is that fancy? No. Anyway, they were people as we know them today, as we are today. They were part of this world.
Take a real tusk that would have been lighter. It's since gotten more dense.
That's a good question. I would imagine possibly some groundwater might have seeped in.
Looks like that's heavy. That thing is,
Yeah, it is, for the most part, original material. So I think after the talk is done, show it around a little bit. It's a little too delicate to pass around, but
Oh, no.
okay. So we look at this Eden-like world that we used to live in, and we think, oh no, we've lost it all. We've lost everything. We have the Salesforce Tower and other things like that, and that's all we're left with. However, we haven't lost everything. This is a time-lapse photo from one location at a watering hole in Africa, taken over 26 hours. So all of these animals in this photo were actually here within about a day. So I want to leave with a note that although we yearn for the past, and we very much envy this world that was full of these wonderful, majestic creatures, we haven't completely lost it yet. So there's something still worth fighting for. And with that, we're happy to entertain any questions, and thank you so much for listening.